All right, welcome everyone. My name is Adam Wadley. We're here for another experimental unit podcast, and I'm joined here today by Rosalyn Mitchel. Rosalyn is a Christian apologist and author from Canada, and today we're going to be discussing Rosalyn's essay, which is entitled "Open Letter to the Left on Abortion." So, thanks so much for joining me again, Rosalyn. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I like to introduce my co-host, Adam. He is the author of the Experimental Unit Substack. He also hosts a radio show on WRFG. He's from Atlanta, Georgia. And we met each other when I was visiting Georgia, and our conversations turned into this podcast, a really interesting way to hear each other out on some very difficult topics that are really asking the most foundational questions in our society today.
Yes, absolutely. I've actually been talking with some friends of mine who are, from the progressive left about this interview. And so I just want to make clear, we're both going to be speaking from our own perspectives. But I'm very interested in finding all of the common ground that we can because I'm going to ask you in a second to introduce your essay, Rosalind. But, it's just so obvious that so much of your concern, Rosalind, comes from, just seeking to protect and allow for flourishing to take place where in our world it might be devalued or people might not understand how important that is. I think we'll be getting into a lot of implications, even broader than the abortion question, because these things are all tied together. But I'd like to give you a chance to introduce your essay. We can go through it section by section as well, but just to give you a chance, Rosalind, to speak about your intentions in writing and in wanting to have this discussion.
Yeah, so I wrote this essay from a place of organizing politically on the left. I'm really an evolution personally of where my politics began. Starting out as a teenager, really into the conservative social media scene, what was online, figures like Ben Shapiro, and then kind of maturing and realizing the more nuances of life was bigger than owning liberals on the internet. I really appreciate the patience of many of my comrades, especially at college, university professors who um, made me realize that the left-wing people are not just caricature of a screaming, angry person with badly colored hair, but there's actual more nuances in our reality. And from there, I did do political organizing with socialist groups, primarily the Democratic Socialists of Canada was my time there. However, I think a third continual evolution was realizing that the whole conception, and we'll get into this article about left and right is in fact a fallacy upon itself because very much our politics and coming from a Christian worldview does not fit neatly into either political category. So that's where I wanted to address to my left-wing comrades, declaring what I saw contradiction in a worldview when I talked about our collective liberation, our collective flourishing against fascism and authoritarianism. I said, well, how about the most innocent among us, children? And often what I was responded was in devaluing of human life or a gap in their understanding where they rightfully saw the suffering of women in front of them. They wanted to alleviate that suffering. They wanted to give women autonomy, but they missed the bigger, what I would argue, holistic picture that if you cannot protect life at fertilization, then really all other human rights kind of fail on the premise because the right to life, I would argue, is the most foundational. So that is why I wrote this essay. Really, it's a place of love, but it's also a place to ask somebody who is not to antagonize them, is not to be an enemy or threatening, but to just ask them to think more deeper about the contradictions in their worldview.
Absolutely. So given that I'm going to let you speak your mind like that, I'm not going to immediately contradict you in case I might have a disagreement. But I would like to just say that for me, the horizon um, of this topic because it has a lot to do with, what are the sorts of choices that we can expect people to make given the levels of support that they are given. Because I think the abortion question and so many ethical questions are not happening in a static space. Where if you're speaking about an individual person who's going to have an abortion or not, and in some sense they're open to it, but they don't have support. If they had more support they would be open to it. But so is somebody going to stand there and just say that they shouldn't have the abortion and do nothing else, or is somebody coming from a place of not only being committed to struggling for an unborn child, but also being committed to um, everything that goes along with that. That child is obviously growing inside another person. That person has their own stresses, their own stuff going on. And so I really think it takes a very holistic level of care, especially when we're starting to sort of be a little judgmental. Obviously, it is a very grave matter. We're talking about a life and death situation here. Um, but the ways that we'll talk about it obviously reflects on people, but oftentimes people are in very uh, I want to say grave again, but people are in extremely stressful and overwhelming situations for themselves personally. So you can speak to that, but I also wanted to give you a chance to talk about the fact that it's not just you. I would like for you to say a few words because we met. You were traveling down to Atlanta. You stopped by City Hall where I was. That's why we even met. But you were here for a conference in which I believe you were presenting. Um, and it was through an organization which is pro-life, but also in this more holistic way. So I just wanted to give you a chance to present the fact that, I'm not saying that you're speaking for a whole movement or anything, but I do want to give any listeners some very important context that there are many. There are thousands and millions of Christians who are pro-life, and maybe other people who are pro-life for whatever reasons, but who are not strictly coming from a judgmental perspective, but have a mind to some of the things that I was just talking about, and have a more again, more holistic, and are willing to take responsibility also for supporting people in difficult circumstances where they might be making these kinds of choices.
Yeah, I would agree. Actually, that is a very good point. We met because I was speaking at a conference for Rehumanize International, and they are a secular nonprofit which opposes violence from fertilization to natural death. So having that consistent ethic and care for community and journeying alongside people is really our mission is to reaffirm our shared humanity. And I wasn't talking specifically on the issue of abortion when I presented. I was actually talking about how we can cross the divide, especially in the context of the US elections, which are taking place in November. And that's kind of where my heart was, is to reaffirm each other's humanity, regardless of one's position in society. A woman who's had an abortion, a devout Christian who would never dream of having an abortion, somebody who's a lifelong conservative or a Marxist-Leninist. I think there's something that you can find about each other's shared humanity that surprises a lot of people. And that's kind of where we have to begin, as asking, um, where is our foundation for any sort of human rights? In my essay, actually, I very eloquently a podcast which I cite called um, Common Threads. Wait, I think it's just Eleanor Goldfield and Carla Bergman, their podcasts. But in the quotes, they talk a lot about um, that idea of where human rights come from. Should they come from a bureaucratic nation state or something more? And I think that's appropriate because, why should we rely on our humanity given to us, licensed out by a government? It doesn't make any sense. It has to be something more foundational that's unchanging other than, lines on a map, which, for history, empires rise and falls, nation states collapse. There has to be something that we all share. and that is our humanity. So the podcast, just to correct, is called Grounded Futures, but it's linked in my essay. And you can listen to the full podcast with both of these women, and they're very eloquent, I'd say, critique on the conception of human rights embedded in this very bureaucratic way of thinking, um, that I think is something that regardless of your politics, you can appreciate that human rights are inherent to what we are, not based on what we can do, our humanity.
Yes. So going back to talking with some friends about preparing for this podcast, people talked about, is it going to be a debate? Um, and I'm really not interested, at least in so much of what I see and the negative connotations that I have for debate are, especially like trying to get somebody to change their mind in a conversation or, just trying to score points. That kind of thing is really not interesting to me. But I am going to bring up some of my own, intellectual ideas about this, and I hope you won't
Yeah.
mind. I'm not,
No, no, that's good. Yeah, I appreciate that.
yeah. So um, something that comes to mind for me is that there are I guess I'm thinking of two main things. First of all, there is the idea that, the category of humanity and human rights, presents itself as a very general thing that includes everyone. But at the same time, this category of humanity can also be used to exclude people. The term, yeah, if you think about what's going on with Israel and Palestine, or in
Mm.
many conflicts like that, the enemy, the bad people, or whatever, whoever's speaking, will talk about people like they're animals or something.
Yeah.
And so, like this category of humanity is one, or the idea that we're all in something together, I think is very powerful. But um, not even but. I also think it's very important for us to be mindful about how we articulate that. So that's sort of a political thing. What I'm saying there arises from some post-colonial, literatures, people sort of talking about, we've been talking about human rights in the French Revolution, but women couldn't vote, or France reinstated slavery in Haiti right after declaring the rights of man. There was somebody who declared the rights of woman, and she was not treated well, and things like that. So there's a sort of political issue there. And I also want to bring up, uh, as I was alluded to before, animals and the idea of other sentient beings. And I'm actually really interested to hear. And again, like I said, I'm really not trying to change the topic, but I
No.
think it would be really valuable, and I would really enjoy hearing you talk about if there's anything that comes to mind for you. I'm thinking of the sorts of passages from the Bible or the Torah, Old or New Testament, where it's discussed that, as people, we're supposed to be stewards, right, um, of life. And so
Yeah.
basically, the thing is, I wouldn't really say something about, our shared humanity.
Hmm.
I actually prefer, like the Buddhist category of all sentient beings,
Hmm.
just because it feels to me more inclusive, I suppose.
Hmm.
I understand that, of course, that there's a certain kind of being that can understand what I'm saying right now, or if we
Right.
translate it into another language, they can hear, right? And they're a kind of person like me, and we're very important right here on this planet, um, and all that. So I understand that's our audience and everything, but I do think it can actually. It might. That's my intuition. I think this might help our conversation about abortion, just because I sort of want to broaden the question to, like, what does it mean for us to have respect for creation, in the broadest sense, and to do honor, right, to the privilege, or, the responsibilities, right, in a way that we have inherited by being here. And yeah, I think that can be powerful, just because um, yeah, while I appreciate, and it's obviously a form of rhetoric that works on or that could work for a lot of people. You're talking about human rights and how people are people. You know, for me, it just comes to mind how much there's so much human life which is devalued, there,
Yeah.
and so for me, it's and beyond that, I'm going on too long, but I have a coworker who's really concerned
Mm,
about shelter dogs and the fact that they die,
mm,
right? And spends hours trying to find, people to adopt shelter dogs. And when I'm thinking about that, it seems very similar in a way
yeah.
to the concern around abortion. Not trying to equate, I can totally understand why some people would
Mm,
find, abortion to be a more serious matter because again, it's this human life thing.
yeah.
But I wanted to see, sorry for that long-windedness, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts that have come up while I've been talking.
Yeah, I think if you imagine our rights in a circle, we don't have to shrink the circle to deny the humanity, or maybe that's not the greatest word, but the inherent dignity of our stewardship towards animals. We can expand that circle, but in doing so, we don't have to give less, of rights to any one group, but just give animals more rights when we have historically denied them as sentient beings. Uh, I would also say that sentiency in itself is a category when we come with language of utilitarianism, which is the idea that it requires a state of being to be sentient, to experience. When, as we were talking before, ultimately everything is derived from not what we can do, but who we are inherently, human or animals, right? That they are protected species, protected family in our beloved communities, and not because they are useful to us, but just being in the presence of them. And I think, when you talked about um, the element of suffering and seeing that great suffering. I think a lot of what our conversation comes down on a moral level and emotional level is the reality of this great human suffering that we see every day in our society, and the fact that, yeah, we're going to be brutally honest and acknowledge not all human life is valued, let alone all animal life. That's another never level that we don't really delve into in our society. But I think the question in those situations is that shouldn't we try to eliminate that suffering, not eliminate who is experiencing the suffering?
Yes. Wonderful. So I think we've given some really good context and laid the groundwork to
Mhm.
discuss your essay a bit more in detail. Um, I'm curious if there's anywhere where you'd like to start. Um, I feel like it seems like you're invested in the idea of argument to an extent. You're working from premises that you expect people on the left put value in, like human
Yeah,
rights and humanity and things like that. And you're trying to show how, based off of commitments that the left, and again, you've already talked about how this is sort of a nebulous thing, but
yeah.
that progressives or something, given values and commitments that people have made for you, and also for many others, or according to your line of reasoning and feeling, that needs to well, I guess I'd like to hear you say it for yourself. For being pro-choice. I mean, um, anyway, do you think that the principles, of shared flourishing and so on, do you think that I want to say a committed leftist, if you'll allow the
Yeah,
ambiguity and vagueness,
yeah.
but do you think a committed leftist needs to be committed to, banning abortion completely so that no abortions will happen in the
I
present?
would say that ultimately, if you're saying that the highest good is our collective liberation, then yes, because ultimately you're fighting for the freedom of all. I know we're not Marxists here, neither of us are or subscribe to that. But the idea of creating a new world to the old is, well, if you're just like reproducing that framework of oppression, then you're really not. doing what you are saying. And that is something that I think is very interesting, is that often the modern left, I'm using generalizations for political categories, especially progressive leftists, fall into liberalism or the self, the individual as the highest good. Um, and very much rightfully, a lot of leftists that I've met clearly make those distinctions. We're not liberals. We have a critique of our capitalist society. We have a critique of this radical individualism, of this consumerism, of using people, of utility, of capital, which primarily runs on, exploitation of labor. It seems very antithetical that then you would follow that in this specific topic when you're debating abortion, appealing to ideas like my body, my choice, is saying that you are, as an individual actor, able to make the highest good based on your own autonomy, and you don't have any connections to your fellow community or from the very personal place of a woman who is carrying a child. You don't have any relationship between the body and the human that you are sharing in your space. And to be fair, that is very hard. I can't imagine, being pregnant because I haven't been pregnant, but from the women who have shared their experiences, it is a toll on the body. It isn't just you're carrying something and then you can exit when 9 months of emotional and, of course, financial and stress and physical danger for some women is very real. And I think that that speaks to the fact that you are connected to another human because that great cost of carrying a child births life, right? If it was not life, I don't think it would require so much of. And I know a lot of people would say, well, then that's about sacrifice. And why should anybody be forced to sacrifice her as a human being? Which falls really into that circular thinking of the individual being the highest good. It's like from all my leftist friends, they idealize and romanticize often the idea of our collective liberation that we sacrifice the fight against fascists. The struggle is not, ourselves. You are never alone. You are literally part of a brotherhood, a comradeship, in a labor union if you're struggling for your rights as a worker, or if you're on the front lines at World War II against the Nazis. It's about something greater than you. It's not about you, really. And I find the abortion reductionist debate often comes to me being the highest good.
Yes, there are some philosophical subtleties I'm really interested to getting into with you here. But first of all, I want to circle in on my understanding of what it is that you're saying.
Mm.
So you're comparing and saying that, um, you know, oh, embryos or fetuses or zygotes, life forms, things that are growing into babies, right, that are
Mhm.
inside people's wombs, that, these are persons. These
Yeah,
are moral persons that need to be
yes,
taken into account when we make moral evaluations. And that,
exactly.
so much of, if you want to call it pro-abortion rhetoric or something like that, so much of it is sidestepping the issue, where
Yeah, it is.
people will say that, it's just a clump of cells. So
Mm.
I want to make clear, based on something that you said, I'm not saying that
Uh,
you were putting words in my mouth, but for me, when I talk about a sentient being,
mm.
I include bacteria. Like,
Oh, okay.
you think about like the Janes, or trying to stop eating, like putting something over their face so they don't eat insects by mistake.
Right.
So I just want to be clear that, for me, this fertilized cell and this thing growing that's growing inside another person absolutely counts as a sentient being. But the moral calculus or something that I was drawing to your attention before, and that I think is so important here is that again, based off of what you were saying, these uh, developing people who are inside of other people's bodies in the course of pregnancy, they are moral persons who need to be taken into account. And so if their lives are going to be terminated, we need to be honest about what is going on there, um, and not just act like there's not a life there.
Exactly, exactly. And that's the point. Is like these categories, zygote, fetus that you mentioned, they don't tell us what member of the human family a child is. What they do tell us is the age. Often people will look and use those terms to say this is a species categorization. They're not human or not fully human. They're developing, maybe. Um, but take the term fetus, which from Latin means young one. It tells you about the age. It doesn't tell you about what, a fetus is or what member of the human species a fetus belongs to. That would be a question of biology, but more importantly, then we can ask the philosophy part is okay, a fetus is a human, but what is the moral calculus that we should put on that human, especially in the earliest stages of development? And that is where you get into, the debate really among people who do acknowledge the humanity, because it's really easy to just sidestep the first part. And I think that a lot of it I'm talking not in academic rhetoric, but just personal experience, especially from a woman who has experienced an abortion. It's easier to not ask that question because if she believes that it's a clump of cells, then she doesn't have to go through the emotional trauma of realizing, oh, I had an abortion. I ended my own child's life, which is devastating, right? And that is the layer that we add about the emotional part about accompanying women. That is so important because I know a lot of people on the left have never really experienced the pro-life community the way that I have, other than a caricature that they're fascist or Christian fundamentalists. They want to deny women their autonomy, their rights, right? But for me, aside from the political labels, I very much see them as the most willing to accompany women and to be with them in those deeply moral places where they're wrestling with these questions. And I think that's the most important is to have empathy, for people who are not like ourselves. And that's why even though we don't remember what it's like to be a fetus or a zygote, we can kind of have empathy for the weaker among us, the less developed among us, and kind of going full circle into the idea that there is great suffering. But the answer really is to accompany people and to be with them to the best that we can and see that we try to find a way to make our world more affirming of our shared dignity.
Yes. So to make clear, um, you know, uh, yeah, just so for anybody listening, I don't think in terms of the shared humanity thing, but I do like the dignity of all sentient beings, and I'm happy to include, um, people that are growing inside of other people, within that category. What comes to mind for me is that, you know. A lot of what we're discussing here is you could call hypocrisy, or you could call,
Mm,
this sort of, it's a rational discourse around, well, you've committed yourself to this over here and you're not doing it over there.
you're
So
right.
I want you to do what you committed to consistently. And
Right. Yeah.
yes, but like what comes to mind for me when I'm thinking about that is that hypocrisy is the real pandemic, right?
Mm,
So when it comes to the idea of placing a moral expectation on someone, the question for me is, where is the good community where, you know, wholesome moral expectations are consistently fulfilled? And for me, so much of the tragedy or the suffering and the pain of going through this world is that it's not clear where that is. Um, I've had experiences recently among progressive leftists, also progressive Christians, and so on. Not going to get into detail, but that have been extremely disturbing to
Mm.
see the kinds of things that I have witnessed. Like for example, an anarchist who's in an abusive relationship, right?
Mm.
A church where people are preaching about how we all need to flourish, but somebody might be being mistreated, like
Yeah,
in a way that's being ignored by the community. And so those are both, again, sort of cutting against the left, but I think that you can also see that, right, like on the pro-life right, or so much
yeah,
of the way that, pro-life discourse is often, and this is, something
yeah,
people often bring up. But I
yeah.
mean, as opposed to just talking about the issue of abortion, there are plenty of people growing inside of other people, and I'm sorry for using that academic language. I really am
Mm.
that much of a language nerd. I'm really not trying to
Okay.
just be weird for the sake of it. But there are people who are pregnant who are addicted to drugs, right? They're not going to get an
Mhm.
abortion, but like maybe they have AIDS, right? Like their
Mhm.
kid is going to be sick. Like bad things are happening. Like the
Mhm.
mother or the pregnant person is being emotionally abused. Like for another one of these extenuating circumstances that I was talking about with one of my friends, because I was saying, so much of it with abortion, we're speaking very all or nothing here. But
Yeah.
terms of the law, it makes a big deal sometimes. How far along are you, right?
Mm.
And some people would definitely, many times, often think that if somebody's 8 months pregnant, it's a weightier choice. The same kind of people who are like, it's just a clump of cells. It's like
Right.
once the fetus can be viable outside the mother,
Mhm.
if there was some, or again, the pregnant person, if there was some radical surgery applied, at that point you're talking about different things. And at that point, it's obvious that that's a sentient being because there's a brain, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's a person who's dreaming, right? Like
Yes.
anyway. But
Yeah.
so, but the thing about it is that I was discussing with my friend is,
Mhm.
say that you're that pregnant person and, you were made pregnant by someone else,
Yeah.
8 months in, this person, becomes really abusive or like they've been
Mhm.
really abusive. And then you realize like this person could kill you, right? And
Mhm.
people are killed by their intimate partners all the time,
Yeah.
and also people are driven to suicide.
Right.
So there are many threats to life. Uh,
Absolutely. Yeah.
when we're and like when we're talking about pregnancy, it's obviously one of the most intense situations that we can be in because well, not everybody understands, but
Mhm.
if you're open to it, you can understand that it's an incredibly grave and serious thing to bring another person into the world.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yes.
so those are some of the things that have been on my mind because to draw the two things together. Um, and there's more to say, but I go on too long. But if there's some, I'll put it this way. I get really concerned if when people are expressing judgment, so
Mhm.
like the idea that there's some poor woman or there's some poor pregnant person who is making a life and death choice, but it's not only the baby's life that's in their hands, right? Their own life is in their hands, in some circumstances as well. Not maybe because of, the medical, I'm not saying there's a medical danger, but like having a child versus not having a child obviously makes a huge difference in somebody's life.
Yes, it is.
There's countless, there's billions of different circumstances. And anyway, I think all of that is very important to take seriously.
Absolutely.
And if we're going to sit here and say, that child needs to be born, then, it's no guarantee that anybody's going to flourish or that anybody is going to, be okay. Um, because I mean, for example, say you get impregnated, you have the baby, because you're so committed to life, and your abusive partner kills the baby, right? I mean, people kill babies all the time, right? Or something. I mean, so
Yes, I know.
anyway, I'm bringing up a lot
Yes.
of these things. So I think it's so important to have that holistic mindset
Yeah.
into as much as possible, not be coming from a judgmental place, especially when you're dealing with somebody who's weighing the question of abortion who is in, what I might call an impossible situation. Somebody who is just in a situation where it really doesn't feel like anybody has their back, nobody is really supporting them, and to ask somebody to have a child,
Mhm.
especially when the other parent might not be a good emotional or might be an active physical threat to them,
I think it
it's a
really
very
does
say.
change when we see these circumstances in our real life, like you're talking to your friend about a woman who's in an abusive situation, who has been sexually assaulted. And it changes when we see that the world is not in these very neat categories, right? And that is what we call the great weight of human suffering. In a world with great human suffering, the worst atrocities among us, like genocide, the question is, well, then what is the answer to that? Other than to find a way to have hope, right? Hope, that is not just an idea, because it can be really detached for a woman who's in experiencing those domestic violence, suicidal thoughts and ideations, to just tell her, oh, have hope. It can be very detached, but it's an active and a living hope, to try to alleviate the immense human suffering that we have to take up every day. And I think you said it well yourself, as a toddler who could be murdered because the woman bravely chose to have her child, but her abusive partner then murdered her kid. In my perspective, we both agreed that's a horrible crime, right? The toddler being murdered. So then why would that change from my perspective if that toddler is at an earlier stage of development inside his or her mother's womb? It's still a brutal act of violence toward an innocent child who didn't choose to be a victim of their circumstances. Similarly, the woman didn't choose to be a victim of her sexual assault or her domestic violence or her addiction. I think that ultimately we have to hold both things in understanding that being compassionate and having empathy for human suffering doesn't mean that we solve the problem of suffering, whispers are suffering, but that we seek to alleviate the suffering by actively having hope and, yes, being pragmatic, not just talking about this idea. But I think it goes well into what I know, and this is my experience of the pro-life community of running centers like pregnancy care center and resource centers. And I'm sure the leftists will have more empathy for this idea of using our government resources instead for endless war and misery abroad to invest here in human flourishing in our local communities, right? And this is where I think we can have that common ground, is reorienting um, our condition towards, you know, agreeing that there's great suffering, but then finding solutions that are active and that accompany women and don't judge them. Because if I were in that situation, I couldn't imagine what what I would do if I, didn't have somebody out there to help me have that hope, that act of hope. And for me, um, as a Christian, that would be my belief in God. However, I know secular pro-lifers who say, well, their act of hope is, relying on their community and having strong communities. And it goes back around to this idea that we are not disconnected even from bacteria. Um, I do like to ask you one question. That's quite a lot that I just said. But you were talking earlier is that you've rejected the idea of our shared humanity. Could you explain kind of better what you meant? I know you're talking about all sentient beings. We're all connected and that all sentient beings. But how would you distinguish those two?
Yes, you did say a lot. I
Yeah.
had some things prepared to say to that, but
Mhm.
answer your question. My, as I said before, I'm a big
Yeah.
language nerd. I've
Mm.
created many of my own concepts. I've done a lot of what I call conceptual design, which is sort of designing concepts. Um, which I would say, normally we just have the concepts that we find. We read in books. There's Christianity, there's
Yeah.
Marxism, and all the different subcon,
Yeah.
different things that people talk about within
Ideal.
those ideas. But it's important to me to be generative, be creative, and also
Mm.
think critically, I guess I would say, about the words that come to us. If we think of 1984, if anybody's familiar with that book, so much of the way that the authoritarian government controls people is by controlling how they use language or, influencing how they use
Yes. Yeah.
language. So anyway, more specifically in that regard, I have been I've taken an interest in a school of thought called Afro-pessimism,
Mm.
which, long story short, is a philosophy which analyzes anti-blackness and talks
Mhm.
about how anti-black discrimination is something that deserves its own analysis. It's not just a kind of racism, but to look at how actually religion has been foundational to this. Some of the scholars go back to the Arab slave trade in 625 and talk about how this is a great example. In Islam, just like in Judaism and Christianity and probably a lot of other religions and spiritual traditions, there's a big difference between how you treat people who are inside your community versus people who are outside your community. So obviously there's way too many cans of worms to get into, for example, with the issue of usury or lending
Yeah.
money at interest. Who can you do that with? But so, for example, that also related to slavery. And so,
Yeah.
one of the scholars of Afro-pessimism, his name is Frank Wilderson III. But so he makes the point that during the Arab slave trade, during 625, they would have rules like you cannot enslave another Muslim unless they're black. So
Mm.
even black people, even other people, obviously we would sit here now and say, slavery is wrong. But
Right.
given the sort of moral standard that was set, of having a religious community and at least not having slavery inside of your religious community,
Mhm.
it's interesting to see, something like a religion is potentially, it has something liberatory to it because you can convert, right? It's not just an ethnic or linguistic thing. Of course, Islam, they all, get involved with the ethnicities of the people who are talking about them. But the idea that you could convert to Islam and then meaningfully be part of a Muslim community is or Christianity or Judaism, like that's pretty interesting. But then the idea that, there will be you'll get certain rights, you'll put it that way, people will treat you a certain way if you do that. But then the idea that there's a certain kind of person that cannot attain, that cannot become a respected member of the community in the same way, no matter what they do. Um, I don't know, is very important, basically. And so similar things have happened with Christianity and Jewish stories, related to the curse of Ham or the mark of Cain.
Right.
Sorts of religious stories have been applied to Black people, for example, and
Yeah.
they made it out to be that, black skin is a punishment and,
Yeah.
it's indicative that God does not love you and you are not part of
The
what we
community.
call humanity. And then, I mean, you
Right.
can look at European colonialism. I'm well aware, I could be more aware, but I know that there were, many Christians who opposed slavery,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
colonization. So I don't
Yeah.
mean to make it like that. But there were also many people who thought that they were Christian, or something like that, who had the idea that, well, I mean, if you rape and kill people who aren't Christian, it doesn't count or something.
Mm.
So obviously, when we're talking about humanity and human rights these days, we're not normally thinking about, um, religion. We're on its face. What we're trying to say is that, all Homo sapiens are included. That's like
Right.
on its face what is being said.
From
But
genetics.
it's really just that I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that, we can talk like that's what we're doing, but to get to one of my big point about beloved community, and this ties into one of the things that I was going to say to you. I was going to say something about 1 Corinthians 13:13. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. So, I mean, you were talking about hope, but
Yeah, and love.
that's important. But, the love that, like, to express our love,
Mm,
given that, people have been misusing, like, people have been talking in terms of love and humanity and peace. And
yeah,
and sometimes, they haven't, I don't know, it has caused some harm because those terms have come into disrepute, right? People roll their eyes when you talk about peace and love because um, they think there's nothing serious behind it or something, or they think that people talk a good game, but then they just go home and watch TV. So
right.
I think, it is important. I believe that morale is very important. And so this idea of having active hope, I'm in agreement with you. But I also think the question for those of us who have a little bit of extra resources where we're sitting here and wondering what we can do,
Yeah.
not just about having hope, but performing service in a spirit
Yes,
of love.
exactly. Yeah.
And the question is, what forms of service, are there to provide? Um, and then to loop that back into the humanity, even as I said, I have that there's that philosophical subtlety, but also I do think in a way learning to care for animals and other life forms is part of the learning that we need to do to be good to each other, like to
Yeah.
understand why it is such a waste. Um, sorry, I'm going to keep going, but I think a very important case to talk about when it comes to abortion is the case of somebody who is open to the pregnancy. Somebody who is not in the situation where they're saying, I really don't want to have a child. It's
No.
like what they're saying is, and many people face this, and it's, probably some of the
Yeah.
people who feel the most torn up about it, is that in a way, there's nothing that they want more than to have a baby, right?
Mhm.
But on the other hand, the reality of the situation is that they don't feel like it's going to go well or something like that.
It is. It is that loving people well. I really appreciate that you brought up the verse in First Corinthians 13 because it is true that everything we have to do is actively loving people. And I think ultimately, the themes to this conversation, looping back, is the problem of human suffering. And the reality is that there's immense suffering each day that we cannot quantify in our own experience, because if we did, it can truly lead us down to despair. But then, what is the answer to that? Is it to let the despair win? Or is it to love? And as you're saying, love is a verb. It's an active choice that we make each day. It is a hope that we accompany people, especially the women who are on the margins and are seeking and asking, I want to have a child. I just am so afraid nobody's there to love me. Because if I cannot love myself and know my own value, how can I love anybody else, really? And that's kind of the state of our society, is that so many people have dehumanized their own worth, their own humanity, who they are. And then from there, they really don't have the hope to love another, but it begins with loving each other well. And I know a lot of people can think that is very idealistic. They would say, well, I just want to solve the material reality of poverty, for example, or of the horrible crime of sexual assault. And I would say, why a person in that situation who is impoverished or is a victim of a sexual assault. Ultimately, we have to meet them where they're at and love them well, and then look at the roots of alleviating that human suffering, um, of investing in that community, because ultimately that is the answer, is love, even though it may seem cliche, it's really not.
Yes, there's a couple topics I'm interested in talking to you about. They're related because something that will come up when people discuss abortion is
Mm.
obviously our relationship to pregnancy has changed so much because of condoms and because of the birth control pill and the inserted uterine device, or anyway, the
IUD.
IUDs and everything
Yes,
like this.
IUDs.
So I'm interested to ask you about contraception. I'm also
Yeah.
interested in asking you, I'm perfectly trying to keep this a professional conversation and everything, but about, sex practices that cannot lead to procreation.
Mm. I
You know,
think
you might
that
talk weird,
question, yeah.
if you'll just allow me to finish, just that,
Oh,
from a Christian perspective, I think there can be sort of mixed messages where
right.
it's like on the one hand, the big tragedy is when somebody gets pregnant and then now we're going to terminate the pregnancy. So we're having
Mhm.
an abortion. But yet, what if somebody's not engaged in any behavior that will get them pregnant? That can also become um, a situation that people will face judgment for, and people who call themselves Christian will say that if somebody's not having children when they have the ability to, that they're being a bad person, or that if somebody is having sex with somebody else who can't get them pregnant or whatever, that's bad. Uh,
Mm.
or if somebody could get somebody pregnant anyway, if somebody's having
Yeah.
dates in sex.
Yes, I know what you're trying to say is
So
like,
I'm curious what you think about that sort of dynamic there.
first of all, I think from a broader perspective, the pro-life movement is diverse. I've worked with atheists, like at Rehumanize, who are fine with all contraception that is non-aborticant, as long as the act of using the contraception doesn't end the life of a child, then they're okay. I think then the question B is within communities or that are religious, like Christianity is not a uniform, as we know. Faith, they're different branches. So Protestants would probably be a lot more open to contraception on average than a Catholic. Somebody who's looking into orthodoxy, yeah, we're much stricter. However, it's not really personal to me, but you're talking about the procreative act in itself and the tragedy of, oh, well, you're being judged for being young and healthy and you're not having kids. Why aren't you? Right? I think that is a lot of the judgment there too, because ultimately we shouldn't be focusing on what other people are doing around us. There's an idea in Orthodoxy that says like work out your own salvation and everybody around you will be saved. So if you're working on that holiness, then you will display that love towards a person and you will not be in the mindset to judge another person. It doesn't change though what I guess if you can talk about the greater theology of what procreation, the act of sex is for, which is the new life. However, what we can do is not be Pharisees and to judge other people for being in a difficult situation. Because if a woman comes and she says, I got pregnant because I was, messing around with my boyfriend, we should love her just the same as we're meeting a widower who was in church and tragically her husband died in a car accident and she finds herself pregnant. Um, just because one is a holy air quotes woman, she is not any more or less deserving of that same love or a child of that same love than the woman who was messing around, with her boyfriend and unexpectedly became pregnant. And I think that's when we try to create categories of deserving and undeserving victims, which really goes back into what we're talking about earlier, is we can talk about our shared humanity, but then even among religious people, we can selectively choose which victims are more deserving than others. And that's why I think Christ himself is so radical, because outside of the institutional churches, very much the parable of the Good Samaritan. He asks, who is your neighbor, right? And that was transformative because historically the Jewish people saw themselves as being set apart from the other communities of lesser than the Samaritans, for example. But Christ really flipped on his head and said, no, actually, we love people who are not like ourselves, who are outside of our communities, though we naturally have that inclination towards tribalism because of our fall. And that is, I think, very relevant to our conversation.
Definitely. Yeah, I feel like there's a part of this where I do need to go to bat.
Mm.
I really feel like my own personal spiritual and religious beliefs, it's just quite ambitious and a bit heretical, but I would like to do honor to the yeah, all traditions basically. So
Mm.
so it's I would not say basically I would tell you something like I'm a Christian or I'm a follower of Christ,
Yeah.
but I can be a follower of Christ and Muhammad at the same time. And if you disagree with me, then I think you misunderstand Christianity. And it gets to a point where I think it's important that everybody can have their own sovereignty. And actually, I'd like to draw a distinction here. So basically, just because, a Christian comes and claims to be speaking in the name of flourishing,
Yeah.
you don't actually have the ability to put a moral injunction on anyone. And
Mm.
like my evidence for that is things like judge not lest ye be judged. And some
Mm.
of the things that I was saying before were, like if anybody's going to sit there and, say things that make a pregnant person feel guilty for terminating their pregnancy, my question is, are you really doing all that you can do?
Mm.
Shift a lot of these problems as quickly as possible? Or are there
Mm.
also times where, you're complacent, right? Where you are, I'm going to use a metaphor here, right? We're aborting the future, right? Because we
Mm.
are not dedicated enough. We are not walking in love. We are,
Yeah. That
um,
is tragic. Yeah.
and we are, anyway, I'm not trying to speak about you in particular. This also affects me, right? But
Yeah.
there are so many times, right, when, we go home and watch a movie or whatever,
Yeah.
or we just, get angry or whatever it is. And the reason why that I think that's so important is that my heart does really break for people who are vulnerable, especially having been a child in an emotionally difficult, abusive household, and being somebody who has been made to feel, like there's something very wrong with me when there really wasn't. I mean, especially when I was a younger person, I hadn't anyway. And so that sense of putting shame on somebody, and for me, the question of who are these people? Like this is stuff that's just kind of happening in my life, not related to abortion, but the idea that somebody would stand there and claim that they are, um, speaking on behalf of universal principles that are not just moral but metaphysical because the
Mm.
creator of the universe agrees with me. It really bothers me. And I know that you don't have to answer for what everybody else says about Christ and
No.
God.
Right.
But and I agree I think we haven't gotten a chance here, but things like gender issues and stuff like that. I'm open to the nuance. I think that there is,
Yeah.
whatever people who have, it's a different version of the same thing, I think, where people
Right.
are like, oh, trans rights matter, but then like they're going to tell you like what gender means. And like that is like nobody's an authority on that, right? You have your own sovereignty to decide like, how you'd like to express yourself. But the idea that, there could be a Christian priest or a preacher, telling people things from the pulpit or that make them feel judged and that they're bad and that people commit suicide over things like that. And there are priests who do that who molest children, right? Like
Mm.
there are Christians who shame people for having abortions who have had abortions, right?
Right.
And
Hmm.
which is, I'm not saying that you can't change your mind and all that kind of thing. What I'm saying
Right.
is that there's a level of, um, I would say, emotional violence and disrespect, which is actually not in the spirit of trying to help people flourish. I really think it's important, even if you're trying to change somebody's mentality and you think that they're basically about to commit a horrible crime and things like that. It's very important to approach that from humility and in a way that respects that person's decision making. Because ultimately, the decision's not up to you. People have been having abortions. People have been taking herbs in order to induce to terminate pregnancies for thousands of years. People have been committing infanticide for thousands of years and millions of years, and
Mm.
we're all descended from people who have done that. And
It's
anyway,
true.
I'm sorry I
Yeah.
get a little on my high horse. I just the idea, yeah, I really don't like, moral judgment, specifically of the person who's having the abortion come into play. I'm happy to say that abortions are tragic.
Yeah.
In some sense, like if somebody doesn't want to get pregnant, like I would support the idea they should avoid, penis and vagina sex, right?
Mhm.
Go use handcuffs and have anal sex, right? Like that's the I'm ready to say that. But then, if we're at the point talking about people who are already pregnant, then, we need to be moving heaven and earth to make it as easy as possible and to minimize the risks and costs to people. If we're going to stand there and say that they're murderers or say that they're doing something horribly wrong, we can all do something to stand back and say, well, what are we actually doing to
I
to
think
to make that as easy as possible?
I think you talked about something about the act of abortion as murder versus the human being who chose to have that abortion. I think we can agree that there's a distinction. And unfortunately, a lot of people do not make that distinction. That's when you get to the idea of judging a person, right? I think the very famous verse, judge not that thee be judged, is saying you can't not judge, is saying don't be a hypocrite. This idea of like take out the plank in your own eye before you go around and look at the specks in everybody else's eye. So it's that idea that yes, let me ask if you could have a consistent moral world where people actually did not judge people. Um, unto themselves. But we know that the act of abortion leads to the death of a child, the violent murder of a child. But there wasn't that moral hypocrisy, which we humans do, unfortunately, all the time. Would you be against abortion?
Uh,
The act unto itself.
Um, I mean, what's coming to mind for me is thinking about
Mm,
how, we send soldiers to other places. Like there's people who like my cousin's husband is a murderer. He was in Afghanistan. He murdered Afghani people
mm.
and shot them.
It's very personal.
And so uh I'm thinking about not I think it's actually reproducing an individualist logic that I think that
Yeah.
you actually understand is limited, in my opinion, to focus the way you put it on the person who chose to have an abortion.
We
Because
shouldn't. I agree with you. It's not on them. It's our failure of our broader society. I think we can agree. We shouldn't be judging individuals who
yes,
choose
well,
to have.
but
But we can. Oh, go ahead.
what I'm trying to say is that there are other people, including all of us, like we are all making choices that help set up that position. You know,
Yeah.
so in particular, you might think about more like the powerful people, like who's sitting there saying that we should send billions of dollars into bombs and not into counseling for expecting mothers or relationship counseling for people or drug counseling or basically saying like this is going to end, right? Like this emotional dysfunction and emotional abuse, we're going
Yeah.
we're going to do something about it so that
Absolutely.
from a certain perspective, like, yeah, that's you're not going to have that excuse anymore because we're
No.
going to take care of it in the
Right.
spirit of service and love,
Yes. I
right?
agree.
And so it's really just a sensitivity that I have also because I have not just, I'm trying to be progressive or leftist. Like
No, I
I
understand.
have I'm trying to say I have individual friends, right, that I'm trying to do right by in expressing myself right now. And it's just like, yeah, there's the person who chose to have the abortion, but there's also a
Mhm.
lot of people who basically chose to put that person in that situation. That's a very
Mhm.
diffuse thing.
Exactly. And
Where, it's one of the things I think differentiates me from a lot of people that I talk to is
Mhm.
I think it's very important to take responsibility
Mhm.
for basically everything. I mean, not it's not to a place where you need to beat yourself up because you're not fixing the world in 5 seconds.
Right.
But, yeah, it's not just somebody else's problem. It's not just that somebody else is like mistreating life. And you already understand, you've already reflected this back to me. But yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's so important for us to foreground that just because it breaks my heart. There's a good song called What It's Like. I recommend to you by Everlast. And, the basic point is, there's somebody who goes in to have an abortion and there's Christian people who think they're Christian outside, yelling at them and calling them sinners and, bad names and everything. And, the final line of that verse is, God forbid you ever have to walk a mile in her shoes because then you might really know what it's like to have to choose.
Mm.
And, in some sense, we all do make similar, anyway, kinds of choices, but I think it's just so important to have respect for, the emotional circumstance somebody's in and the fact that people can become overwhelmed. And the same way that like, as I mentioned, my cousin's husband, like people go over and they commit murder like as soldiers, and then they'll come back and they're also not supported. Like those people also often commit suicide. I don't want them to commit suicide. I don't want them to, I think those people also deserve support, basically. So if I sit here and I say that, and I'll acknowledge that abortion is killing a sentient being, I would also basically say I differ from you in the judgment. I think it really does mean don't judge because uh, like not in the sense of don't make discrimination, don't like make choices, but in the sense of don't condemn an individual. Like even
Yeah.
obviously the idea of murder has sort of a moral condemnation aspect to it. But that's why I'm trying to say to you that like I believe in a spirit of forgiveness and
Absolutely.
love that includes murderers as well.
Absolutely, I agree. And that's why I don't, like, for example, support the death penalty, even for a murderer. This is my position. Not everybody holds this, but I would say foundationally, we are really actually, I think, try to say the same thing, is that we can love the person, even if we don't love the act of abortion that they may have chosen in their past, because the past doesn't define them. Even if they've chosen an abortion, we shouldn't see that this is a black mark that they can never erase, a stain that can never be erased. It's not true. And we should love them. And we should accompany them and we shouldn't judge them. I would say that the act in isolation of abortion, the ending of another human life through violence, a sentient being, as you say, is a violent act that can be condemned. However, the woman who experiences that and may have chosen that, as you said, under coercion, under threat, under violence, poverty, should not be judged. So I think we come to the same conclusion in a way that we don't judge the woman. However, the difference is whether the act in itself, the act of abortion, should be condemned or not.
Yeah. I would say again, I'll refer you to John 3:17, where it says
Mm.
that Jesus came not to condemn the world, but to save it.
Yeah.
I personally take a stance of refusing to condemn. Um, so, or any action even, um, just because the things that lead to them are complex.
Yeah.
Uh, Again, to focus on, I think we might be coming up to a little bit of an ending here. I want to focus again on the issue of, people who, in some sense, want to have a child, but they have an abortion because they don't have the money, because, their partner is abusive or not
Yeah.
reliable, or, their parent. Anyway, there's all sorts of reasons where, people are already in a very bad situation. Maybe they're already contemplating suicide, right? Or
Yeah.
whatever, and now they're pregnant and it's obviously a very fraught situation. um but I mean, to think about it, there's also people who have depression and anxiety, or people who struggle to regulate their emotions, and
Yeah.
they drink or they consume substances, and then maybe they drive and they kill people, like drunk driver. There's all sorts of actions that people take that end human life.
Yeah.
And obviously, I think abortion is an issue where, it's a very active, passive thing where, obviously the person who's inside of the other person is not able to take action in the sense that you might be able to avoid a drunk driver or something like that. Um, and also, I think it feels like a very discreet thing because it's like, did the person go to the clinic or not? Did they sign the paperwork? They have to like agree, right? And so, like, it feels like something where it's like, yes, you're doing this, and like, you're doing this to something which is completely helpless.
Yeah.
And so, I can have some empathy and I understand that it is a very grave and I'm trying to think of the right word, but just a very stark, it's a very morally powerful example. But I'm just trying to broaden the conversation because the point that I'm trying to make is, what is the standard where human life is respected? Because I don't see it, right? Among the lawgivers, among even the people who espouse themselves as being Christian, like there
Yeah.
are people who drive their own kids to suicide or who throw their kids out of their house because they don't want to have this
Mhm.
procreative sex that we're talking about or whatever,
Right.
right? And so, as much as it is important to focus on one issue at a time in order to get into some depth and the complications and everything, I really think that what I have to say about abortion and why I think it's so important to try and not be judgmental about not just people who have had abortions in the past. Like I would counsel somebody and I would support somebody in the process of having an abortion even if I understand that, this is a killing or something, it's like we live in a world of very extreme trade-offs. And people are dying in Ukraine and Russia right now. People are dying in Palestine. People are being driven to suicide by preachers, by their parents, by authority figures. People are being killed by police officers. And so that's the world where we're talking about this. And it still is important. Every single person who dies, whatever, every single person is important. Every hair is numbered, right? I'm not saying that, because all these bad things happen, we don't get to talk about this. It's just
Right.
that as somebody who has been in a case, not in a case of like somebody contemplating abortion, but what I'm saying is like I take it really hard, right, when people judge me. And I've recently come to
Mhm.
to think about like, who are these people to judge me? Not that I
Mhm.
don't want to take any feedback. I want to be self-critical and continue to get better. But at the
Mhm.
same time, like for us to really try and make a loving intervention, I really think our integrity really needs to be in the right place. There is, I think, a little bit of danger that, we're getting on our high horse and we feel like, we're such good people because we're standing up for the unborn who can't talk for themselves. And it's like, that's very good. But in a way, I think it can be it's more difficult to stand up for people who can talk for themselves because they're going to say things where they're not
Mhm.
perfect people, right? Like
Exactly.
a pregnant woman who's addicted to crack, right, is not going to be an angel, right?
Right.
But
No,
but that's an important person to go to bat for, and not just
exactly.
anyway. Thank you
And
for
I
for
agree.
your patience. Go ahead.
Pretty much I agree. You don't have to be a perfect victim to deserve, the radical act of solidarity, of love and empathy, of inspiring them to hope. Absolutely. And I see that you really care about this issue because it's personal to your friends, to people who in your life that have experienced abortion or have contemplated getting an abortion. And that is, for me, something that I can see why you are so passionate about, right? And I'm going to be honest about myself is that I was personally against abortion for a long time, but I didn't really, well, actually, really, because of your shared critique of the problem of human suffering, of, the lack of consistency in this world, I was kind of very wavering. I didn't want to condemn abortion in the sense of the law because I knew that if abortion was banned and we didn't fix the root issues, that there would be a greater impact of suffering for women, right? And then that's kind of my journey is realizing that in itself, the act of abortion as a violent act, taking the life of a human, cannot be justified. It doesn't mean that it has to be bound up with judgment of the woman who chose to have an abortion or is coerced into having an abortion. It doesn't mean that we can't solve and simultaneously look at the systemic violence and try to solve problems of poverty, of war, of sexual assault and domestic violence. We should do all that. But I think when it comes down to it, is what is an act of radical love for your neighbor? And if we know our neighbor, our preborn neighbor, is facing violence each and every day, we have to choose to love them and accompany their mothers, who often are abandoned, unless we choose to actively love them. And that is where I come from, not judging, but understanding that out of love, I want to be there for people in our very fallen, dark world. Have a
Excellent.
good, yes.
Yes, I want to impress upon you, the listener. There's so many more things that we can say. I've sort of run out of time here, but I wanted to say to you, Rosalind, I'm very open to having another conversation along these lines, and we'll have a lot more time. I have no cap on my time for the amount of time I'll discuss this issue with you. And yeah, I really appreciate being able to talk with you about this. As you had mentioned, there's some difference of opinion or how we express ourselves, but I do believe that we're both committed to um, trying to understand what it means to love as broadly as possible, and to try and focus on issues that crystallize, matters for us. Um, and retain some humility, some we're still learning, we're still figuring things out. But at the same time, when it comes to things where we've seen enough, we understand that there's a big issue. Um, we decide what there is to think and do about it. Um, and I'm going to call out again. I really, and again, in closing, it's something that you'll see in the progressive left or whatever. People will talk about reproductive justice is not just about the right to terminate a pregnancy, but the right to continue one. If you want to talk about, there have been processes of government sterilization, of people who were deemed, unfit to have children, sometimes because of their ethnicity or their racial, designation, or, whatever other judgment was made about them. People have been, prevented from having children. And in that other sense where, we're talking about is abortion, where somebody's thinking about having an abortion, when they basically part of them, like in an ideal world, they would continue the
Yeah.
pregnancy. But in the world that we live in, they don't want to.
Mhm.
I agree with you that where we can apply love in that situation is thinking about how we can make it to where the circumstances are as ideal as possible,
Yeah.
not just to get from 49 to 51 so
Yeah.
that the abortion doesn't happen.
Right.
But um, but because I really think there's a this all goes together, right? I mean, if you help a child flourish, that child can do work, they'll become a doctor instead of not, or they'll be able to care about people, and they will be a source of love, right? And that's really what we want to be doing, and it all goes together, right? In certain,
Yeah.
um, I'll give you the last word, but I'll quote Jesus again, for talking about, what you do to the least of mine, you do.
Yeah.
And as you were saying, it is a person. I do know people. Haven't really been thinking about the people I know who've had abortions, but it's also something for me. It's more general than that. It's the pain of being judged. And maybe I'm overusing the word judgment, but it's just, when you get the vibe from somebody else that, they really think you're doing something wrong, and, you really have to do what they want you to do or else you're a bad person. And um, and the fact that sometimes people can feel that way, and somebody may or may not be trying to make them feel that way, but it's like, yeah, just as somebody who actually takes things hard and actually beats myself up over things, I think lots of times it's easy to think, oh, people just think they own their body and they think it's so easy. It's like,
No, it
no,
isn't.
like this is
Yeah.
very grave, and having sensitivity about that and being very careful, to look at our own integrity and to make sure that we don't just want to be self-righteous or, grandstand, but that we are actually coming from a place of love, which, yeah, yeah, for people in those situations, and thinking about it more broadly, I think that that's getting to the place, like interacting with a person one-on-one, where you're able to connect better because they're not going to be as defensive, they're not going to be as scared of you because they actually believe that you're not going to judge them because you're actually trying not to, or something, or like to the extent that you have a disgust reaction, keep it to yourself, right? Like
Mhm.
that's um But then I also think it helps in terms of thinking more broadly because, being able to prevent abortions from happening or anybody from dying, that's going to involve working with people on the individual level, like with their emotional problems, but also dealing with relationships, dealing with communities, dealing with big picture political things, because so much of this, I mean, is related to, political and military policy and things like that. And so,
Mm.
I think keeping that broader thing in mind,
Yeah.
is important for me, and I really just empathize with people who, you know, get put, it's like people would feel like, oh, you're such a bad person because you had an abortion, but it's like, there are people who make money off of jails where people kill themselves by the dozen, anyway, so it's
Yeah, I don't think they're inherently bad, like you were saying, right? They're not inherently bad people.
yeah, but
Yeah.
thank you for your patience again, as this isn't an emotional issue for me, and also one I think is very intellectually involved. So, as I said, I'm very open to discussing this with you again, but I'm really interested in letting you have the last word. So, whatever you'd like to say here at the end, feel welcome.
I want to just say, really thank you for your time. And I don't want to speak more than is appropriate because we spoke a lot. So I'm just gonna let the audience sit and listen and meditate on what they heard.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I've
Yeah.
been speaking with you, Rosalind Mitchell. I don't think I mentioned before. Rosalind Mitchell is the publisher of Evangeline Press, out of Canada. You're in what city in Canada do you reside in?
I'm from Toronto. So yes, Toronto is where I live.
Great. Yes. So out of Toronto, Rosalind is publishing Evangeline Press. Um, again, Christian apologist and author and podcaster. Thanks again, Rosalind, for joining me here on the Experimental Unit podcast.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Great.